How's everybody doing out there? This is Pete. We are at D.I.Y. Auto School today. The concept and deceptions of epoxy primer are like watching Niagara Falls. Have you ever been to Niagara Falls? Have you seen the water just pouring down and pressure and water flowing out of it, and it feels like it's raining all the time, and yeah, mist everywhere? Well, that's what we got going on with epoxy primer. We got a conception, a lot of deceptions of circumstances that people don't really realize what epoxy primer is. Now, this is where all the theories started of epoxy primer. There were several companies that came out with 2K primer. That's what this is. This is 2K primer. And they came out with that product and they said, if you add reducer, if you take your reducer and you add 10 to 20% to our 2K primer, it becomes epoxy primer. That's bullshit. That's bullshit. That's bullshit. It's a lie. It's not true, and it doesn't work. Even paint stores, reputable paint stores, will sell you that product and tell you to do that. It's a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie. All you're doing is thinning out your 2K primer. That's it. You're thinning it out, and it's still a sandable primer. It is not a epoxy sealer. 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 Did you hear that correctly? Sealer. Sealer. Sealer.
Welcome to D.I.Y. Automotive School with my friend Pete and Minnie, the body shop girl. It's everything you need to know about cars and more.
There's a difference between primer and sealer. Now, another problem that we have is when you look at the epoxy primer up here on the shelf, when you look at that, it states right here, epoxy, and then they use the word primer. Primer. And that's what confuses everybody, because if we come down here, it says high build primer. You see what I'm saying? This is the situation you have. This hardener that goes with this primer is not the same hardener. Look what it says here, epoxy primer, not the same type hardener. Anybody that's ever used epoxy glue, it's a two-part system. Once it reacts, it becomes a super hard glue. That's the same thing with epoxy. Remember that word, epoxy. It is a primer. You put the primer on the vehicle or whatever you're painting, but it is a sealer primer. It is not a primer that is like this one. When somebody tells you add 10 to 20% reducer to your 2K primer and it becomes epoxy primer, that's bullshit. Total bullshit. So now that we've cleared that up, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and proceed with the video. Always remember, 2K primer or any type of primer that is a sandable primer is not a sealer. Non-sanding primer is epoxy primer. Sandable primer is high build 2K primer. End of story. So we're going to go ahead and mix our epoxy primer up, because like I said, we are not going to prime, we're not going to seal the whole item. We're only going to spot prime. Now there is a couple items that we will be putting our primer on the whole thing, but we're not going to do it on everything. I will go ahead and say that when you epoxy prime the whole item, if you don't do it properly, it will orange peel. And then everything you put on top of that will orange peel. All right, you won't get a very smooth glass finish. So, in my opinion, If you prime your item properly, and that's whatever you're painting, I call it item. If you prime it properly using your 2K primer and you sand it down properly, you don't have to epoxy prime the whole thing. The 2K primer is paintable surface. It is not an epoxy primer though. It's a paintable surface, but it's not used as an epoxy primer. I have already went over that. So you want to make sure that you mix your epoxy primer up thoroughly, all right? Don't half-ass it. Don't just do it lightly. Make sure that you mix it up long enough where all the contents become one. If you're using an epoxy primer that's thick, and these after brand names, if you notice I use PPG, if these after brand names, these one-off names, their primer is going to be a little thicker. They're going to advertise, hey, we got the best stuff because ours is thicker. Well, when it comes to epoxy primer, I'm going to tell you right now, thicker is not better. This is not 2K primer, people. This is not something we're going to sand. It doesn't sand. This is sealer. You want it to go on nice and thin. You want it to lay down with no orange peel. You want it to look slick as glass and look like silk, okay? Another good thing about epoxy primer, if you have some very, and I'm talking minute scratches, you can go ahead and use your epoxy primer to fill those in. I'm not talking big giant 36 grit scratches or 80 grit scratches. I'm talking about if you have a surface that might have some mild scratches on it, you can go ahead and use your epoxy primer to fill those in, and it'll give you a better surface to paint on. We're always going to take our epoxy primer, I don't care how good you mixed it or whatever, and we're always going to use a strainer. It's very important to always strain everything that you spray. So we're now ready to go out into the paint booth, and then we are going to do exactly what I said. We're going to go ahead and spot prime. We're going to spot seal. I'm sorry, I used the word primer. We're going to spot seal the surface to give it that accurate position that we need it to be in to go ahead and apply our paint. Let's get out there. Let's get her done. All right, so here we are in the paint booth. Now you see I got everything ready to paint, and what we're going to focus on is we are going to focus on the primer job on the outside of the items that we're going to paint. You can see right here, I burned through the primer as I was painting. There's a bunch of spots. Do you see that right there? Here's a couple more up here. Here's some action going on right here. I see a couple actions right there. And if we look at this fender right here, you can see there's very minor spots where I burned through that we will be spot priming. And then of course on this fender you can see right here, basically the same thing as we repeat ourselves, showing you where we burned through. And then we also have the hood that we're going to have to go ahead and spot prime as well. We will go ahead and fully epoxy prime the back side of the deck lid, the rear valance, and the front valance, front and back. And you can see on the deck lid right here, there's a few spots where we burned through on the edge. And then the other door shows spots as well. Now one thing about spot priming your items instead of fully covering them with epoxy sealer is you want to make sure that your gun is set up properly. You don't want to have it set where you are actually priming the whole surface, but you want to set it to where the pattern is a little smaller and you're not spraying as much. Alright, the volume is actually closed down a little bit. When you're spot priming, you want the coverage to be very small. You don't want it to be very wide because you'll get a lot of overspray. And when you create overspray, that'll be dry spots. So be really careful when you're time. And there you go right there. This is now ready for paint. You can see how I spot sealed it. I did not put sealer on the whole item. It's unnecessary to do that when you don't need to. And more than likely, when you seal the whole item that you're painting, what's going to happen is you're going to get too much primer on it, and it will have orange peel. If you look right there, you can see, look how smooth the epoxy primer went on just for me adding 10% reducer. Really makes it flow out nice. So all these pieces are ready to paint. I'm going to let them sit for approximately 25 to 30 minutes, let the epoxy dry really, really good. I'll come back with a wipe all, which is a tack-free, lint-free rag. I'll lightly wipe this down. If there's any overspray dust on it, I'll remove it. And you can see right here, I don't know if you can see that in the camera, but there's some kind of substance right here. I need to wipe that down with a dry wipe all. I don't use tack rags. I do not use tack rags. Tack rags have wax in them. If you use them the wrong way, or you don't use them properly, which is the wrong way, then what happens is you're going to get fisheye. So I hope this little video has helped you, the viewer, realize that epoxy primer is not a primer, it is a sealer. It's a sealer that's going to seal up your item where it needs to be necessarily, and you're going to be able to prime it with the sealer and go straight into paint. This is Pete, my friend Pete, your friend Pete, trying to make you aware that there are companies out there telling you bullshit stories, so you buy their products. Always use epoxy primer and 2K primer separately. It is not one universal situation. I don't care what anybody says. We'll see you later. Take it easy. And the next time you paint, hopefully, you're going to save time, energy, and money by doing the spot prime job instead of the overall job.